So I've recently done some tutorials on how to install a live system using either Grub2 and an ISO or UNetbootin to your hard drive so that you have a fresh install every time you start up your computer without having to use a CD or flash drive. Well, someone asked me, can you make a multi-boot USB drive or multi-boot on your hard drive? And yes, you can. I've done it before using the ISOs and Grub, but I realized I gave this a try. I thought it would be harder than it was, but I figured out how easy it was just to use UNetbootin to put multiple distributions on a flash drive or a hard drive, and it's actually really simple, and you just have to make a few changes to the config file. So first off, I've got a 1 gig USB flash drive. Now, because it's 1 gig doesn't necessarily mean that it is 1,000 megabytes. Right here you can see I have free 977.1 megabytes. So that's my space to work with. So let's also look over here. I've got a few distributions downloaded. I've got Linux Mint, which is my favorite, one of my favorite desktop distributions, just for a full-blown distribution. It is 674.3 megabytes. So that's going to use over half our flash drive, but we've got other distributions on here. I got a version of Slacks here, just a base KDE install, 200 megabytes for that. TinyCore, which is 10 megabytes. I've got SLTAS, which is 30 megabytes. I got SLTAS Base, which is command line only, which is 8 megabytes. And I've got DSL Linux, which is 50 megabytes. Overall, we'll highlight them all. We have 972.3 megabytes. So looking once again at our free space over here, we have 977. That gives us 5 megabytes to work with. Let's get all these distributions installed. Most of them should install fast. The largest one is Linux Mint. It's going to take the longest. Let's install that one first. So I'll select here in UNetbootin. I will go to my downloads folder, my distros folder where I have them all downloaded to. I'm going to choose Linux Mint here. And I'm going to choose that ISO. I am going to, I have to restart UNetbootin because I plugged in my flash drive after I started it. So UNetbootin will ask you for your root password. Type that in. Here we go. Once again, we'll just go and we'll click where our Linux Mint ISO is. Make sure you have the right drive selected here, and we'll click OK. So here it is. It's decompressing, and like I said, this first part will take a little bit because of how big Linux Mint is, but since the other distributions are so small, they're going to be pretty easy and quick to install. But you can see right away here, it's basically unpackaged the ISO. And under this Casper folder for Ubuntu and Linux Mint is where they put their root file system. So you can see right here is our root file system that's squished down, and it's being decompressed onto, well, it's not being decompressed because it's still going to be compressed down. Now, when you have the ISO of a distribution, usually the file system is compressed, usually to about 1/3 the size. That's why something like Ubuntu, which has a 650 some odd megabyte CD image, once it's installed, takes close to 200 megabytes to install. Under 200 megabytes, but I'm sorry, 200 megabytes. 2 gigs to install. So basically, think of it as anytime you have an ISO that you're going to install, think of it to expanding to about 3 times, maybe a little bit more after you install. Good thing about this, we're keeping it compressed. So we can fit a lot of distributions on a small keychain. So we got 1 gig here, and like I said, we're going to be installing, let's have a look here again, 6 different distributions. And this is just great because you can have different distributions for different tools. You can have Linux Mint, which does pretty much everything, but if you're working on an older machine, you may want to use something like SLTAS or DSL. And it's just, you can have your own custom rolled distributions for doing different things. So once again, this is going to take a little bit. We're about 44% here, and at any point it's just going to all of a sudden jump to the end because that 44% is just that one large file there. The last thing that UNetbootin will do is install a bootloader, and there's a config file in which we will edit. We'll open it up in our text editor, then we will install our next distribution, and all we have to do basically is copy and paste the entry that we want from one to another, make one or two changes. In certain instances, most distributions will put their file system and their kernel usually inside a folder called boot. Well, we can't have them all go inside boot because they'll overwrite each other. So for each one, for the most part, we're going to have to rename that boot folder and then re-edit the entry. It may sound a little complicated. Actually, very, very simple. You'll see once Linux Mint is done installing. Once again, it's a larger distribution. There we go. We're going right here. It's creating the bootloader, and we're going to hit exit. We're not going to reboot. So for this part, we're just going to open up this sys Linux config. We'll display it. Here we go. And what we have here is our bootloader. We've got a title here, we've got a timeout, then we have our default label, which I'm just going to delete, but you can edit if you want or leave there. And you can see we have Linux Mint, and it has a few different options for Linux Mint because that ISO had a few different options. Really, all we care about right now is this first one right here. And you can see it uses the kernel from the Casper folder, and it uses the other files inside the Casper folder here. And that's where it will look for our file system. So let's just copy that. We're going to have to reopen up UNetBootin now. Didn't ask for the password because I already typed it in and it's saved for a limited amount of time. We're going to go to our next distribution. Let's do Slitaz. I'll choose Slitaz. I'll click Open, and I will click Install. Make sure you have the right drive selected. Click OK. It's saying something already installed. It's going to overwrite some files. That's fine. Just click Yes to all. Here it is copying over the root file system. And in this case, you'll see that it installs it to a boot folder. And that's where the Slitaz files are going to be for the kernel and for the file system. So UNetBootin's done already because that's such a small distribution. We'll hit exit on that. Now, before we install the next one, since a majority of them are going to use that boot folder, we're going to hit F2, and I'll just relabel this Slitaz, if I can spell it right. That's important to be spelling things right in situations like this. Okay, so that's renamed. And if we go back to where we were editing before, you can see that it's saying that the sys Linux config file has been modified since we've opened it. Let's grab this first entry for Linux Mint. We'll copy it and we'll say reload, and you can see it's redone it for Slitaz. So what I'm going to do here is Slitaz once again also has a few different options. I only care about the first one here, entry 0. I'm going to paste below that the Linux Mint one, and I will change that entry to 1. So we got 0 and 1, and this is where they're going to show up in the list here. Now, like I said, we renamed the boot folder to Slitaz, so we're going to rename this Slitaz here. And don't forget to get where the root file system is, Slitaz there as well. We can save that, but it's going to be overwritten here in a moment. What we need to do now is open up UNetBootin again. Open it up. We'll choose our next distribution. Let's do Slitaz base, which is going to be the command line only version of Slitaz. We'll click open on that. Make sure you have the right drive selected. Click OK. Yes to all to overwrite. And that one is only 8 megabytes, so it's going to go real fast. It's reinstalling the bootloader here. We'll hit exit there. And you see here, it created once again the boot folder. We'll just say, we'll rename that base. So that's renamed to base. And now we'll go back into our text editor here. Once again, it has been overwritten. But before we reload, let's copy. And we will copy and hit reload. And what I'm going to do here is I'm just going to hit paste there. And I will put 2 there and delete everything below that. I hope I'm not losing you here. It's actually quite simple. We need to relabel where the kernel is. In this case, we renamed the folder base, and we'll rename this one base for the file system. And you see this one's called Slitaz and this one's called Slitaz. Let's call this one Slitaz-base. And that's just what the label's going to be in the menu so you know what you are installing or what you're loading. Once again, let's open up UNetBootin. We'll choose our ISO here. We'll choose DSL Linux in this case. This one's going to be 50 megabytes. Yes to all to overwrite. And once again, this one's 50 megabytes, so it will take a little bit longer than the SLTAS one did. But there we go. It already has happened. It's recreating the bootloader now. We're going to hit exit, go back to our text editor. We're going to copy and paste the entries we care about, which is our 2 SLTAS and our Linux Mint. And we'll click reload. I'll go right here underneath the default. I'll hit paste. I'll rename this 0 entry to now 3. So we got 0, 1, 2, 3. This one already is labeled as DSL. We'll say DSL for the folder. Same thing here. DSL. We will come back here, and where we have our boot folder, F2, we'll rename that DSL. We've already got 4 distributions installed on this flash drive. So now we're going to open up UNetBootin one more time. And we'll install TinyCore. TinyCore right there. And we'll click OK. Everything's selected properly. We'll click OK. Yes to all. TinyCore is only 10 megabytes. It installed quickly. I'm going to hit exit here. And we have a boot folder there. Now, at this point, we can just leave that one there since it's the last one. I also have Slacks I downloaded. We'll do Slacks too. I just don't want to run out of time. But we'll rename this to TinyCore. We'll go back to our text editor here. We will highlight the entries we care about, 0 through 4. Make sure I get the right 4 here. Okay, DSL. Okay. We're going to hit copy. We're going to hit reload. TinyCore only has 2 options. Actually, 1 option. So that makes it easy. There's nothing to erase after that. We just have to rename this one to entry 4. It's already called TinyCore, although you can call it something else if you want. And we have to change where it says boot folder to TinyCore, because that's what we renamed the folder. TinyCore. And that's it for that. Let's open up UNetBootin one last time. This time we will choose Slacks, and hopefully we have enough room. We should. Hopefully extracting the ISOs doesn't decompress it too much, because, I mean, the file system's still compressed. Actually, I think we don't have room for that. Now that I'm looking, it says we have 192 megabytes, and that ISO is 200 megabytes. So I don't have room for that. I could roll my own custom Slacksware, because I can make that as small as 50 megabytes for a base system. Don't have time to do that in this tutorial. I have done tutorials on that before. So all we have to do is, let's double check this. We can retitle this. We'll call this My Multiboot, and that's just the title at the top of the menu. We can erase this default one unless you want it to go to a default thing at the timeout, but I'm not going to do that. We've got all our entries here. We've got SLTAS, then we got Linux Mint, then we got SLTAS base, then we got DSL, and then we got TinyCore. All we have to do is hit save, close that. We can eject that flash drive, and at this point we can stick this into a computer and reboot, and we'll get a menu with all 5 of those options on there, and we can boot to any of those live systems.